to the, okay. I also put a link in the chat to the value rubric for written communication. So if you don't have a copy of it yet, you can see it there. If you look at it on the website, it'll have like a watermark. They want you to actually like order it, which you don't have to pay for. It's completely free. They just like to keep track of who has downloaded it and that sort of thing, but you can get it from that link if you'd like. So looking at the poll, looks like we have a lot of different people here. I'm kind of curious who all our others are. A couple assessment professionals, some people teaching writing outside of English, generally interested in classroom use, and sounds like mostly people want to listen, which I can talk for quite a while on this, so that's cool. But we should have some time for questions and such in the second half as well. So, all right, should we end the poll maybe? And share our results so you can see. All right, so I'll share my screen now so you can see my slides. Okay, seeing slides? Excellent. Let me make the poll not show anymore. All right. I'm trying to move the poll so it's not over my slides.
We don't see your poll, if that helps.
Yeah, I know.
We can close it on our own screens.
I can't close it on my screen anymore. Oh, well. I can work around it. All right, so I'm Jennifer Grueling. I'm an associate professor and the director of the writing program at Ball State. And I've been studying the value rubrics, particularly the written communication rubric for, it's been like about 6 years, maybe even a little longer, which is kind of hard to believe. It started with a pilot study here at Ball State where they were using the written communication rubric for some core curriculum assessment. And then I've moved on to a book project I'm working on right now that is in its first draft. It's an institutional ethnography where I'm looking at how 2 small schools adapted the rubric. But through this process, I've really thought a lot about assessment, about rubrics, and many, many other things. In fact, the book ends up being more about power relationships at these schools and relationships among faculty than it is necessarily about rubrics. And if you know me, which I see a couple of you do, you'll know that I can be very critical about rubrics. So if you want to follow me on Twitter to get that perspective, that's where I tend to be more snarky about it. But I do think that that they're not always a bad thing. I think they have a role to play. And so I think mainly what I want to question is that they're always like a default choice. So what I want to do today is to think more about when and why and how we're using them. And so rather than tell you about the book, I'm going to do more about kind of some lessons I've learned about adapting them and talk you through some ideas for that. So while we're getting settled here, like I said, I put the link to the actual value rubric for written communication in the chat a bit ago. I wanted to do just a quick overview of the history of value. So value stands for Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education. And it's connected with LEAP, which if you're here, you may know stands for Liberal Education and America's Promise. And so this is a big movement under the AAC&U. Back in 2007, testing, was still quite popular for assessment, and AAC&U was looking for some different ways to do things, some more authentic assessment. And they started by getting together a bunch of faculty, but also employers, and talking about what are our essential learning outcomes? What do students need to know when they graduate from college? And so the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes came out in 2007 with things like written communication as one of the core outcomes. And then they started gathering teams of faculty members to come up with rubrics, which they kind of called meta rubrics. So that's the value rubrics. There's 16 of them. And one of the most popular ones of those is written communication. And I wanted to stress that at this point, the teams that were making the rubrics were really faculty experts. There's a lot of really amazing scholars from writing studies who created the value written communication rubric. And then next, the AAC&U went and tested them with a bunch of different schools in their different collaboratives. And then we come to kind of now in 2019, they've started the Value Institute, which is where schools can actually send in student artifacts or papers, and they're scored expertly by trained raters through the AAC&U. The university gets a report on that, and they can kind of compare how they're doing on different things. So today the rubrics are really popular, and as you can see, they've been used everywhere from the very large scale, but also they are often seen kind of as exemplars for the classroom or something to modify for the classroom. So is a value rubric for you? Well, I see a lot of you are interested from the poll in their use in the classroom. So I think it depends a lot on who you are and what you want to do with the rubric. One thing that I'm finding in my research is that a lot of people don't use the rubrics the way they were intended, and I think that can be a problem. So I want to talk about kind of their original use and then how what we might need to modify if we were going to use them in a way that wasn't their original purpose. So the original purpose of the value rubrics, so they each assess one particular outcome, right? So just written communication, not written communication and something else. But as Linda Adler-Kastner, who's a famous scholar in the field of composition, but also one of the authors of the written communication rubric, said in a famous speech she gave, writing is never just writing. So it's important to note that each of these rubrics have a very specific and fairly limited purpose, but also it's hard to just kind of narrow it down to that one thing. The value rubrics are actually meant for large scale assessment. They're not meant for classroom use as they were written, which is why, again, we have to talk about adaptation. And in fact, they were originally designed with portfolios in mind. So usually kind of at the end of a student's career, submitting an e-portfolio or something like that and using value rubrics. And so they're meant really to capture student growth over time, rather than like one isolated moment in one classroom. And some schools are using them that way, but I think it's probably more common that people are using them with just one artifact right now or one paper. And finally, and this is one of the original purposes that seems to be happening the least, particularly the written communication rubric is supposed to be used in conjunction with the assignment prompt. The student artifact was not meant to be separated from the prompt, and that's been a huge logistical challenge for the AAC&U and I think for assessment professionals in general, as they've done more large-scale assessment with it. And in my experience, it's much more common to have the student artifact separate from the assignment prompt, but that does pose some problems for how the rubric was written. So a lot of these issues, I think, can be mitigated if we adapt the rubric or alter it. But I think it's important to kind of know what you're looking at when you're looking at the original and what its original purpose was. So I want to go over how the rubrics are structured. And I assume you've all seen rubrics, but just so we're using some of the same terms when we talk about different parts of the rubric.
Hey, Jennifer, could I interrupt for a second with a question?
Yep.
I'm in the Miller College of Business, and when the writing proficiency test, I'm on the AOL team, so we are separately accredited by AACSB, and one of the things we have to do is writing.
Mm-hmm.
And when the writing proficiency exam, after Anna sunsetted, went off to rest and relax, the university no longer does the writing proficiency exam as part of accreditation. So we're searching for a way to replace that assessment. I don't know what the AAC&U is, but is that a service that our college could use to submit writing samples and get our students assessed?
Yeah, that's what the institute is. So if you check out the Value Institute on the AAC&U is the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Like I said, they're kind of over LEAP, over value, but that is a way that people are using this is for assessment purposes for accreditation for sure.
So one quick follow-up question, and I'll let you go back to your explanation. Who would I contact, or who do I refer our chair to reach out to find out how this might work?
I mean, we have a new assessment director, so you might contact her, Carol Kafinas, here at Ball State. But you could also Google the Value Institute.
Thank you.
Yep. So just like I said, to kind of go over the parts of the value rubric, so we're on the same page about what they're called. One of the most common things I've seen in adaptations is that the first page is completely eliminated. And I think that you really want to look what's here, because here you've got a description of the rubric, you've got definition of the outcome. You've got, so this one actually is from a handout by the AAC&U, and it's for critical thinking, but if you've looked at the written communication one, you can also follow along with that. And here we've got some framing language, which is really important to me because, for example, the written communication one will reference statements by our professional organizations about good writing assessment. So it really grounds that in the research in the field. And then another area here that I think is important is the glossary, which defines the terms that are used on the rubric. So I'd say do pay attention to this first page, which is not the rubric itself. And then you have the rubric itself. And just so we're clear on some terminology here, the left-hand side has the dimensions, and which are the categories used for scoring. And then you've got the performance levels. The AAC&U has 4 of those. And then the descriptions, the performance descriptions, which break down what each of those dimensions looks like at each level. So when we look at the performance levels, I mentioned there's 4 of them. And you'll notice that the AAC&U put the top level first. And this was very intentional to make a more asset-based rather than deficit-based approach. So the first level is level 4, the capstone. And what's really important to know here is this is the level the college graduate should be achieving. And then there's 2 milestone levels, which are kind of progression in between during the course of the degree, and the benchmark, which is usually skills found in the beginning level of the college, for beginning level college students. So in my study, one of the things that's happened a lot with the rubric is that people have reversed this order. But this was very intentional by the AAC&U to stress like the highest level where we want to get first. Also, these are not meant to be turned into grades. So as you can see, like if you're working with first year students, they shouldn't have to reach this capstone level for an A. That's meant to be kind of towards the end of the degree. So that's something to consider if you're looking at these for classroom use, and we'll talk a little more about that. Or if your institution is, isn't necessarily doing poorly if your sophomores end up at a 2, right? That's where sophomores maybe should be. Another really important thing to note is that the AAC&U doesn't see these as equidistant levels. So you're not meant to add up the score. So a 2 is not necessarily as much above a 1 as it is below a 3. That's something I learned in a recent workshop with them, which I thought, is definitely something people have not been really understanding about the rubric. So it's really just meant to describe like these basic, like these moments in a student's progression on a particular scale. And then there's a score that's not on the rubric at all, which is the 0. So the 0 is meant for any artifact that doesn't have that particular dimension. And I think it's really important that we know about this because we don't necessarily know why it doesn't have that dimension. So for example, in national studies of the written communication rubric, we're seeing lots of low 0 rates across the board, except in evidence and sources. So what that means is there's not a lot of sources depicted in the artifacts that AAC&U is gathering, but we don't know whether that means that students are bad at using them or whether it means that instructors aren't assigning projects that require sources. But I think it does give us some useful data for asking some follow-up questions about that. Then we can dive into our curriculum and see, like, are these assignments actually requiring sources? Are students struggling with them? What is happening? So the 0 is meant to depict things that are either below the benchmark or just not represented in that work at all. And I have seen the 1 category, the benchmark, turned into like weak or unsatisfactory. And again, that's not really how this rubric works. So it's rather supposed to be a very positive level of achievement that you would expect for a first-year student. So really the 0 is meant to be the one that's below that. So another thing about the original rubrics is they are very much meant to be adapted. The language is very vague. It's meant for large scale assessment. It's meant to be used under very specific conditions where you know, like I said, you have the assignment prompt, so if you want to use it in other ways, like the classroom, you definitely need to change it up and adapt it. So I have some tips for doing this, some do's and don'ts that I've seen in my research. And I think these probably apply to all the value rubrics, although like I said, I've really studied the written communication one. So things that you should do, and again, like the AAC&U starts deliberately with the positive, so you shouldn't flip. Oh, I'm on the shouldn't. Let me start with the should, like they do. If you want to assess more than one particular objective, I think it's great to combine some of the value rubrics. So I worked this summer with some colleagues in criminal justice to make a writing rubric, and one of the things that they really valued was ethical reasoning. So there's a separate value rubric for ethical reasoning, and we took some of the language and made a dimension for that on our rubric for criminal justice writing. So I think that combining the rubrics can work really nicely. Also, since the rubrics are quite vague, if you are using them for more specific circumstances, I think you need to make the language much more specific in the performance levels and the dimensions. And that's certainly, you know, in your classroom, you'll have much more specific controlled environment than you would for a larger scale assessment. So some things not to do. So like I said, the dimensions aren't meant to be combined for a total score, so it shouldn't be adding up the categories unless you modify it so that that's what you mean to do. But as is, you shouldn't do that. One of the most common adaptations I've seen is to reverse the performance levels, and then that takes more of a deficit-based approach and works against kind of the original purpose of the rubric. And again, the performance levels don't equate to grades, so you can't just slap some grades on there. You need to actually change what they stand for if you're going to use it in the classroom for grading. You wouldn't expect a freshman to write at a senior level to get the A in your class. And also definitely don't go making it more vague. It's very vague already. So, and this is something I think a lot of people think they won't do, but sometimes they try to capture every conceivable project, every conceivable thing that could be done in the classroom. So we're going to talk more about specifically written communication now. Are there any kind of questions first about the value rubric, value rubrics as a whole?
There are a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat, so if you want to throw those at me, go ahead.
The first question is just if you'll be able to share your slides, and if you share those with me, I can share them out.
Yep.
And then somebody said those definitions seem to clearly articulate ideas that we often assume students inherently know. Question mark.
Yeah, I think, again, this rubric wasn't written for students. So if you're going to make it for students, you have to define those ideas a lot better.
Okay. And then the last question is about the benchmark. Where might we obtain that data?
The data on?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Jeff, do you want to elaborate on your question?
Yes, I'm immersing myself in LEAP, so I'm trying to find and navigate around your sources that you probably refer or point to in setting these, the benchmark, the and some of the other, I guess you could say, rubric pointers for a basis for a staff member to conform to your convention.
Yeah, I mean, the AAC&U has a lot of publications on the value rubrics. So I've got a few of those kind of at the end here. And like I said, I'll share the slides. Lots of data on how those are working. And I think we'll probably get more into this too. So maybe we can touch base again at the end. All right, so let's talk about written communication in particular. Because I think a lot of what I said applies to the value rubrics in general, but that's been my focus as someone in the field of writing studies. So the definition from the rubric, I'm just going to read this. And I've put some of the highlights on the slides. Written communication is the development and expression of ideas in writing. Written communication involves learning to work in many genres and styles. It can involve working with different technologies, mixing data, text with data and images. Written communication abilities develop through iterative experiences across the curriculum. So one of the things I'd like to happen in my first year writing classes is for students to realize that writing is a lot broader than they think. It involves a lot more, and they are writers a lot more often than they think. Writing plays a huge role in our world. And so I want them to kind of come away with that understanding that it can involve images, it can be in different styles, all of those things. So let's go over the dimensions of the written communication rubric. And I'm going to kind of delve into each of these a bit more. So these are those things on the left-hand side of the rubric. And in terms of writing rubrics, historically, the focus on context and purpose has been not always there. That's something a little bit more recent that nods to how important that is to writing. Oftentimes, I'll see adaptations where genre and disciplinary conventions is changed or even dropped. And I think that that's good if you're going to actually define what those genre and disciplinary conventions are, because as someone said, like that those the terminology of writing studies like genre might not be as familiar to students. And then another one that I find kind of actually a little disturbing is that content development often gets dropped. So we're going to go through these one by one, and I'm going to give you some more definitions and some more to think about with each dimension. So context and purpose for writing. What does this mean? Well, one of the things I've often found people to misinterpret this as is that they think that it means that the text should be understandable to anyone who reads it. That anyone should understand it, and then that means the students meeting the needs of the audience. And this is why I think it's really important to have the assignment sheet in conjunction with the rubric, whether that's in your classroom or for larger scale assessment, because without that, it's hard to know who that audience or what that purpose is. So for some types of text that might be clear, but it's definitely different to tell. It's difficult to tell if a paper is just written poorly for, say, an academic audience is intended, but it's not pitched at the right level, whether the student actually intends to pitch it for a more public audience. But I really want to resist this notion of a general audience, and that's something I talk about with my students as well. They'll try to say, oh, I'm writing this for anyone. And I think that this gets into kind of the real factors to consider here is that even if you attempt to write something for anyone, that text has to be circulated in some way. So students will say to me, oh, well, it's going on the internet. Anybody can read it on the internet. Well, theoretically, but they aren't going to. They're not going to find it. That's why people like my wife actually gets paid to target ads to very, very specific groups of users on Facebook, right? Because you aren't just going to necessarily stumble across anything. So when we're looking at context and purpose, and a lot of this comes from the glossary of the rubric, we're looking at who's reading the text, who's writing it, which I think is a factor we often forget when we think about context. So often we want to just ignore who the author is and how the text is going to be circulated, or even what political or social factors are affecting the text. So there's a lot really to think about here. And I think this category really captures what makes teaching and doing writing really difficult. So I want to encourage you to think about these factors when you're drafting your assignments, as well as when you're drafting your rubrics. All right, content development. So I think a myth here is that a lot of people, and I think this is why a lot of people drop it from the rubric, is that writing's just translating ideas. but we know that it's not. Writing is a cognitive process in and of itself. We develop and come up with ideas through writing. And we can't say that writing can be evaluated separate from thinking then. So ideas are always shaped by writing, and the topic is always represented in relation to an audience. So I'll give you an example here actually from a non-writing class. I teach my gaming class, which is super fun. But if you've seen any movies based on video games, were they any good? A lot of them are not. Why is that? Well, it's because those ideas don't just simply translate from one form to another, or from one audience to another, right? Like the writing affects the ideas affect the writing. So that's important to consider. Genre and disciplinary conventions. This is one where a lot of people's eyes start to glaze over. They get annoyed at our fancy writing terms. But these concepts, I think, are really key to teaching and assessing writing. And I think one of the myths is that everyone can agree on what good writing is, and they really don't. In fact, studies show that even when people have common terms, like if writing is clear, writing is concise, if they're interviewed in more depth, they mean very different things by those terms. So you have to know how the writing that you want from your students is shaped by the genre and the discipline, and communicate those things to students. So here's a real simple example if you are less familiar with the concept of genre, and you'll have to watch my video for this. So if I do this, what am I trying to communicate? That I want to talk, right? Okay. Now, if I do this, sorry, it's going to be above the screen there, but that's communicating something very different, right? I'm communicating maybe solidarity or resistance. So the context and the audience really matter. Am I at a Black Lives Matter protest? Am I at a union meeting? Am I, in a Zoom call on Rubrics and I want to have a comment, right? So the basic gesture is different. It means different things in those different concepts. And I think that's really the basic concept of genre is that those differences and how those are seen by an audience and understood, it's going to vary depending on the genre you're writing in. And then in terms of discipline, there's so many rules about writing in your field that are different from another field. And so even if you're writing in a common academic genre, like a lit review, maybe if you're writing for a humanities class versus a science class, it's going to be really different. Which one are you going to quote your sources directly? You're probably more likely to want to do that in your humanities class than in your science class, because that's one of those disciplinary conventions. So sometimes I'll see this category replaced by organization, and I think that organization is definitely related. But I think you'll have to define more like what is the organization of that genre or that discipline that you're looking at. So you can't just say a generalized, well-organized paper. There is no, organized paper varies depending on if it's a lab report or a proposal or a lit review. It's going to be different. So again, I think this is where you can explain to your students what this means in less vague terms when you're using this rubric in your classroom, rather than have it just kind of use these vague ideas. All right, sources and evidence. So there's two more categories. I think again, another myth is that academic texts are always going to be used the same way, or academic sources are always going to be used the same way. So we've talked a little bit about this in terms of like direct quotes are more common in some disciplines than others. But even, I think one thing to even think about is where in the paper is a certain source appropriate. So let's say I want to start with a personal story that I read on a blog. It's not coming from a peer-reviewed academic source. Well, if I put that in my lit review, it probably doesn't work as well as if maybe I start the paper with it. So in getting more specific in this category, I think it's talking to students about where certain types of sources are appropriate, what genres are appropriate in, and recognizing that different disciplines are going to be more direct in disagreeing with other sources. Do you say the author of this source was wrong? Do you say their data was limited, but never even mention their name? So all these conventions vary, which is why for using these in the classroom, we have to really define them for students. And then the last category, control of syntax and mechanics, which might seem like the easiest, but is not. And I think the myth here, which actually comes from one of the schools I've been studying, they combine this category with process under the assumption that the reason for mistakes in papers is that students haven't proofread or haven't revised. But I think that's really just one reason for mistakes to exist. I mean, clearly a common one. I do that, but it's not the only reason. So some factors to think about, and this first one might blow your mind a little bit, but readers define what counts as an error. So I think that this is in the power of the reader. And there's a classic study in my field called The Phenomenology of Error, where Joseph Williams published an academic paper in an academic journal, and he purposely put a ton of grammar errors on it. And his point was, you're not going to catch most of them if that's not what you're reading for. So not to mention that what an error is also stems from what English you're using. If you've ever had to revise for an international journal, you might have had to make some edits, with yous and things in your certain words, right? So if we default to thinking that only standard white English is correct, well, then that's still the reader defining what's correct or what's not, what's an error, what's not. Another reason that errors might occur is that perhaps not maybe that's not even the right word for them. Errors might not be the right thing to call them, but the students come from different language backgrounds, and that's true from both international and domestic students. A moment I really love from my research that I wanted to share was a faculty member from Singapore who's multilingual, said to me that he noticed that when he reads a paper by a native Chinese student, he can understand the argument even when there's standard grammar errors because he knows both languages and he can understand the thinking behind the paper. But his white colleagues will say, the grammar errors here interfere with the meaning. I can't understand the argument. So that to me really reinforces this idea that the reader is the one really defining the errors. And then lastly, I'd like to say that skillful writers can use non-standard academic English grammars in really powerful ways, even in academic writing. So I actually just finished teaching a really great piece in my classroom where 3 Black women authors wrote about racism and professional dress. And they use Black English at various places in their article. And it wasn't any less academic, it wasn't any less theoretical or smart. And clearly it wasn't any less wasn't less proofread. So I think when we're talking about grammar, there's a lot of really challenging things to think about here. So maybe you're feeling like this now. How are we doing? Teaching writing is really hard. Assessing writing is really hard. Just, writing is really hard. So I'm going to give you some tips about writing rubrics. So I think really to do this, we need to think like writers because I think a lot of people talk about, well, faculty write, they publish articles, but you're writers in your classrooms writing classroom materials, assignment sheets, rubrics. So thinking like you would with any other writing task, who's your audience? What's your purpose? What's your context that you're writing this rubric for? So I want to ask ourselves those questions in relationship to an assignment maybe that you want to assess, or if there's a larger assessment you want to conduct, maybe kind of have that in mind as we're going through this. So first, thinking about your purpose. When we ask ourselves this, we often consider what genre we want to use. Is my purpose to show solidarity in a protest, or is it to get you to let me talk, or, so I'm going to choose a different genre. So is the rubric even the genre that you want? That's the first question I think we should all ask. Like I said, I don't want us to just default to rubrics are cool, rubrics are easy, because they aren't easy. So I think rubrics are good for things that have clear conventions or that are easily progressed through. So if an assignment has a lot of variety, or you want the students to have a lot of flexibility in how they write it, a rubric might not be the best way to assess that. So I'm much more likely to use a rubric if I'm assessing a proposal than I am if I'm assessing some kind of narrative I've asked the students to write, where maybe I want them to have a lot more flexibility and not really pin them in with a rubric. Excuse me. Let's see. So, another thing that I think is maybe not as good for rubrics is if there's a lot of factors beyond the student's control. So like if you're doing a community or service learning project and some partners might be better than others or work better with students than others, that's something that maybe is better assessed by some kind of a contract grading system or a checklist, something where you have a lot more flexibility than you would in a traditional rubric. All right, and then once you've decided a rubrics for you is written communication, what you're really trying to assess. So do you want to assess writing plus other objectives? So you might consider, like I said, combining some different rubrics. Some ones that I think are commonly combined to an extent with the written communication rubric are critical thinking. It's obviously a lot of overlap with that. Information literacy, if you really want to stress the sources and the research is key to the project, you might want to take a look at that rubric. Like I said, I did one this summer for criminal justice with them that made me really happy because I was really glad that they wanted to stress ethical reasoning. I think that's so important in criminal justice. And so we took one of our dimensions for the rubric that was for writing from ethical reasoning so that we could really stress that in their writing for their students. And then thinking about what your context is. So what is it that you're assessing, excuse me. So if you're trying to assess a whole program and you're drawing artifacts from multiple courses, well, then a rubric is going to have to be pretty vague. If you're assessing students over time through maybe a portfolio at the end of a major, then you're going to have to account for different genres they might have in that portfolio, different types of assignments they have in that portfolio. Again, the rubric needs to be more vague. But if you're assessing students on one particular assignment in one particular class, then it's time to get really specific with your rubric. Thinking about, do all the different dimensions actually fit here? Is this the thing that I want this assignment to do? So while you're thinking about that, also think about your institutional context. So like I mentioned in my study that I've been doing, I have 2 schools and they're very, very different. One of them is open admissions, one of them is really competitive. So benchmark is not remotely the same for them. Students come in at very different points. And so I think that that's one thing you want to think about when you're adapting the rubric is what is the benchmark? What do your first year students look like at your institution? And then on a course level, thinking about the same thing. What level are your students? Are they seniors? Okay, maybe you want to start with the capstone level of the rubric then, and that's like not the top. Maybe that's the middle if you're assessing seniors. But if you're freshmen, maybe you don't expect them to get to that capstone level. Which again, I think is why I wanted to go over how the rubric was originally designed. Also think about your assignment and where that falls in your class. Is it the first assessment of the course, the first assignment that you've done? Is it the last one? What have you taught them so far? So you don't want to necessarily grade them like it's the end of the course if it's assignment number 1. So my tip here, I call these hints, I think, because I've been playing a lot of puzzle games lately. But my hint here is to think about the level and then start with the appropriate performance level on the value rubric and work from there. So if you say have first year students only, maybe you make that benchmark the middle of your rubric rather than the starting point of your rubric. And then you kind of flesh it out from there. What's a little bit less than that? What's a little bit more than that? All right. Okay, I already covered some of this. Some other things to think about in terms of your institutional context are, that disciplinary conventions that we talked about. Is that something that your course or your institution really values? If this is like a senior biology class, then a lot of your students are going to go to grad school. Maybe it's really important to talk about those. but it may not be in every class. Does your course actually teach syntax and mechanics? If not, why put it on your rubric if that's not what you're expecting them to get out of your class? Does this assignment ask for sources? If not, maybe that category about evidence and sources is really focused on evidence. Maybe they went to see a play and they're using examples from seeing the play. All right, try to speed up here on time a little bit. All right, in terms of audience, then, who's going to use this rubric? Who's going to read it? Are you reporting up to administrators on this process? If so, they may even want you to use some of that language that's like directly from the value rubric, because that lends it some credibility from national circles. That's good, but students, like we said, aren't necessarily going to know all those terms. So maybe instead of putting genre and disciplinary conventions on the rubric, you explain what that is for your lab report or whatever your assignment is. So some other hints here. I think it's great to involve students in rubric design if you're working in the classroom. So maybe you look at the value rubric together and say, like, okay, here's the level for first year students. How do you think this fits with your assignment? Does this category fit with your assignment? Are we looking for sources? You know, that could be a good thing to do. Or just look at the assignment sheet and go from there. But it helps you understand where they're at with the assignment, but also them understand what you want their paper to look like. And also you can test it out, or maybe your students use it with peer review and see how it works. You might show it to a colleague, see if they understand where you're coming from. And then if you decide to use your rubric, I definitely recommend taking notes on what worked and what didn't work as you're grading. So maybe students surprised you by doing a really cool thing that was nowhere on your rubric. How can you give more credit in the future if students take that direction with the project? And then real quick, because I think this is super important, comes from an article called How Writing Rubrics Fail. And Valerie Ballister in this article gives some suggestions for making rubrics more multicultural, in particular when dealing with mechanics. She talks about how it's important to focus on mechanics in terms of writerly agency and rhetorical choice. And so we've already kind of talked about that a little bit. But I think, she's got some good tips here, like avoiding words like standard or like fluent, words that evoke and assume a male, white audience and reader and writer. So that's something I've noticed participants doing in my study when they've not had access to the assignment sheet and they don't know who the student is they say things like, well, he obviously did this. You're assuming who that writer is. And I think there's a default assumption there. And lastly, I wanted to just encourage you about resources you can use. So consulting others in your rubric development process, experts on your campus in assessments, experts in terms of instructional designers on your campus or a faculty development center, look for workshops there. If you're assessing writing in particular, come find people like me. Hopefully there's some writing across the curriculum. There's not much of that at Ball State right now, but I'd love there to be more. The Writing Center might have workshops as well. I know the Writing Center at Miami, Ohio actually has tutors who will look at your assignments and rubrics and give you some feedback on them from a student perspective. So, look for resources like that. I think that's really important. And then of course, consider your students as a resource as well as you build a rubric, if it is for your classroom, getting their feedback, making sure it makes sense to them. So I want to make sure we had some time for discussion and questions, but I have some sources here that are from the AAC&U on the value rubrics and the link to the rubric itself. And then also a couple other sources I mentioned in passing, including here's an article I wrote about the value rubrics. This one is not about rubrics, it's about, but is that one I talked about that uses Black English in an academic setting. So if you're looking for an example of that. And then just a plug for the WAC Clearinghouse because they have a ton of resources for writing in many different disciplines. So if you're looking for advice and teaching writing in different fields, that's a great place to go. All right, thanks. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see questions in chat and whatnot. librarian says that it's an excellent combo to use with information literacy. So I couldn't see the chat when I was actually had the presentation going. I saw a couple of you were interested in potentially brainstorming as well for rubrics. So if anybody has anything they'd like to share about questions they have for a context that they're trying to develop a rubric for. Here, I sped through the end thinking you'd all have tons of questions.
So any questions or comments for Jennifer? I'm particularly interested in hearing, I'm also from the writing discipline, so I'd love to hear from people who don't teach writing and any questions that they might have as well.
Yeah, so to clarify, the value rubrics are for programs, not necessarily a particular course or assignment. Yes, they were made with the intention of doing large-scale assessment, university-wide assessment type of thing, not written for students to read, not written to be taken into the classroom, not meant to grade with, because again, those different levels represent really different points of a student's career rather than within one class. So, but yes, a lot of people have been using them for the classroom. I think they need a lot of adaptation though. But I think they can definitely offer us some guidance. And like one of the nice things I've seen come out of this is people saying like, well, I never thought to include audience on my assignment sheet. And now I realize I need to tell my students who they're writing for. So I think that can be a good takeaway. I thought it was interesting too, that the first person asked about the writing proficiency exam and like accreditation, because one of the things I am seeing is that people are using rubrics that really look nothing like the original value rubric, and yet they're saying it's an adaptation. And I think that there's definitely a like rhetorical move to connect to national practice in a way that accreditors like, and that like power structures like. So I think that that's something to consider too.
Jennifer, do you know, by the way, that their decision to use the content development, why they came up with that? I really liked your explanation of that, and I realized that I hadn't fully understood what they meant by that, but just kind of wondering how they came up with that. It almost sounds like kind of K-12 language in some ways.
I don't know specifically. I know that the faculty teams who came up with the rubrics looked at a lot of existing rubrics on different things. You know, and obviously all this language comes from a bunch of different places. Tracking any of it down is difficult, but yeah, I think it's interesting that that one disappears a lot though. And I think that speaks to a larger perception that writing is the mechanics and not the ideas. Someone says, thinking about audience is very useful if students are writing discussion boards for other students versus a research paper or a letter to the editor, to elected official. We should encourage them to think about the audience. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that I'll say too, is like, you know, do you need to grade their grammar in a discussion board? Really? Like, I it's for other students, is that the purpose of that? So I think that's very important, thinking about the audience and the purpose and the expectations. Anybody want to share anything they're working on in terms of using the value rubrics? Someone says that audience tends to disappear from other frameworks like transparency and learning and teaching, tilt. I've seen those with LEAP as well. And those, one of the things I liked about the tilt workshop that I attended is that we did actually like run assignment sheets by colleagues in other disciplines and say, does this make sense to you? I think that's just a very valuable thing to get that kind of feedback, and the same thing with rubrics. Any questions about like my research study? This has been more application stuff, but I could talk about that too.
So I have one since you asked. So there was that, I've always been interested in that, the Dan Melzer, the assignments across the curriculum, which basically shows that students, that they aren't writing for audiences beyond the instructor, and the instructor is expert, which always bothers the heck out of me. And I'm sure most people who teach writing, has your research, does it have any kinds of parallels with that? Have you found anything out about, does it seem to confirm that idea that most people aren't really writing for real audiences at all?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And, I think that using the rubrics as is something kind of reinforcing that, or like using them apart from the assignment sheet is reinforcing that, because how do you know the audience if you don't have an assignment prompt with it? So there's an assumption that it should be for any audience. And but I will say, like, one of my participants was talking about how when she read the value rubric and saw that writing for just the professor seemed like the lower categories, she was like, oh, I should be pushing my students beyond this. So I think it kind of depends on how it's being used and where. But definitely an issue that comes up a lot. All right.
I love the idea, by the way, of using writing center tutors to kind of help instructors with their assignment sheets, because I think sometimes they don't believe me when I consult with them and tell them that, they're unclear or the audience is sufficient. And, of course, writing center tutors would be the best for that, for just asking questions.
Yeah, I heard Miami was doing that, and I was like, oh, that's awesome, because I've tried to do that with my TAs too, bring in some real students to look at their assignment sheets and see. And it, not even like say, where is it confusing, but say like, how would you approach this? You get this assignment, what's the first thing you do? It's fascinating to see how their brains work and how they process the information. So yeah. All right, well, seems like we are running out of questions. Thank you all for coming. Happy to chat more. I'll send out the slides and have my information on there as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I will also send out the recording and information about our next coffee hour. So thank you so much, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks.